Every parent's worst nightmare is watching their child suffer while feeling powerless to help. Every child's deepest fear is losing the one person who keeps them safe in this world. In the winter of 1887, mountain man Luke Calder found a 9-year-old girl standing barefoot in the snow, guarding her dying mother. The child looked up at this stranger and said words that would haunt him forever. "Save my mother, I'll do anything you want." Luke had lived alone in the mountains for 15 years, avoiding people and their problems. But something about this little girl reminded him of his own lost family. Taking them in was supposed to be simple, just get them through the winter. Instead, it became the fight of his life, as Luke discovered that saving this family meant facing the ghosts that drove him to the wilderness. But what terrible secret from his past would threaten everything he was trying to protect? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain peaks stood like silent sentries against the pewter sky, their snow-crowned heights catching the last amber light of a December afternoon. 15 miles above the valley floor, where civilization clung to existence like frost on a window pane, Luke Calder's cabin nestled into the rocky shoulder of Mount Galena, like it had grown there from the stone itself. Inside, beside a fire that cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls, Luke sat in his father's old leather chair, staring at a daguerreotype he kept hidden behind, loose chinking between the logs. 3 faces looked back at him, across the span of 16 years. His wife Martha, barely 22, holding their daughter Lily on her lap, the child's chubby hands reaching toward the camera with innocent wonder. His son Samuel stood beside Martha's chair, 7 years old and grinning with the gap-toothed smile of a boy who believed the world was full of adventures, waiting just for him. The photograph was cracked down the middle, the silver tarnished with age and tears that had fallen on it too many times to count. Luke's calloused thumb traced the fracture line that seemed to split his family in half, just as time had done. 16 years. 16 winters of solitude, of conversations held only with the wind and the elk that passed through his valley. 16 seasons of watching the aspens change color with no one to share the beauty. 16 years since the Comanche raid that left his farm in ashes and his heart buried alongside 3 fresh graves in what used to be Missouri. Luke closed his eyes and let the familiar ache settle into his chest like an old friend. He could still smell the smoke, still hear the thunder of unshod hooves on hard-packed earth, still feel the crushing weight of failure as he held Martha's broken body and promised her he would take care of their children. A promise he couldn't keep because they were already gone. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and Luke tucked the photograph back into its hiding place. Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning through the pines with a lonesome voice that matched his own. Tomorrow, he would have to ride down to Coldridge for supplies. His larder was running low, and winter had another 3 months to run. Coldridge. Even the name left a bitter taste in his mouth. The mining town squatted in the valley like a collection of weathered bones, populated by men who came seeking gold and stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Luke avoided it when possible, but necessity had its own demands. He needed flour, coffee, ammunition, and lamp oil to see him through until spring. The townspeople called him the Lone Bear, though never to his face. They whispered stories about the mountain man who lived above the clouds, inventing tales to explain his self-imposed exile. Some said he was running from the law. Others claimed he'd lost his mind after too many years in the wilderness. A few suggested he was part Indian, as if that explained his ability to survive where other men would perish. None of them guessed the truth that Luke Calder wasn't hiding from anything except his own memories, and that solitude was the only medicine he'd found for a grief that refused to heal. He rose from the chair, his joints protesting after too many hours of stillness. At 34, his body carried the accumulated wear of hard-living scars from knife fights, a left shoulder that ached when storms approached, hands permanently stained with work and weather. His beard had gone grey at the temples, and his hair hung past his collar in the manner of men who cut it themselves with a hunting knife and a piece of broken mirror. Luke moved through his evening routine with practiced efficiency. He banked the fire, checked the locks on his gun cabinet, and set out his clothes for tomorrow's ride. The Winchester stayed beside his bed, loaded but not cocked. The Colt Peacemaker hung on its belt from a peg near the door, 6 rounds in the cylinder and the hammer resting on the empty chamber. Sleep came fitfully, as it always did. Luke's dreams were populated by ghosts, Martha singing while she kneaded bread, Lily chasing butterflies through the tall grass, Samuel trying to whittle a whistle and cutting his thumb instead. He woke twice before dawn, each time reaching instinctively for the empty space beside him in the narrow bed. The morning broke clear and cold, the thermometer beside his door reading 20 below zero. Luke's breath formed clouds as he saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Ryder, who'd carried him through 7 Wyoming winters without complaint. The animal's coat had grown thick as a bear's fur, and his hooves were shod with special shoes designed for mountain ice. The ride down to Coldridge took 4 hours through country that would have killed a less experienced man. Luke followed paths known only to himself and the deer that used them, winding through stands of lodgepole pine and across meadows where the snow lay 3 feet deep and unmarked by any footprint save his own. As he descended, the temperature rose and the air grew thicker. By the time he reached the tree line, he could see smoke rising from Coldridge's chimneys, and the sound of mining equipment echoed off the canyon walls like the heartbeat of some great mechanical beast. Coldridge had grown since his last visit 2 months ago. New tents and ramshackle buildings lined what passed for Main Street, and the population had swelled, with men drawn by rumors of a fresh silver strike up Broken Creek. Luke counted at least 50 new faces as he rode through town, most of them wearing the hungry look of prospectors chasing fortune in a country that killed more dreams than it fulfilled. He tied Ryder to the hitching post outside Morrison's general store and stepped onto the boardwalk, spurs ringing against the weathered planks. Inside, Ezra Morrison looked up from his ledger book and nodded, the closest thing to a greeting Luke ever received. "Calder, figured you'd be coming down about now. Need supplies." Luke handed over his list, written in the careful script his mother had taught him back when the world still made sense. Morrison studied the paper, his lips moving silently as he calculated. $47 even. You want the usual credit arrangement?" Luke nodded. Each spring, he brought Morrison furs and gold dust worth enough to cover a year's provisions. It was a system that worked for both men, requiring minimal conversation and no social niceties. While Morrison gathered the supplies, Luke wandered the store's narrow aisles, his eyes cataloguing items he didn't need, but somehow found himself considering. A child's coat, sized for a girl of perhaps 8 or 9 years, a wooden top painted in bright colors, a lady's shawl made of soft wool that would be kind to skin worn raw by harsh weather. He shook his head and moved toward the ammunition counter. Such thoughts led nowhere but heartache. Outside, the sound of commotion drifted through the store's front window, raised voices, running footsteps, the sharp bark of men giving orders. Morrison looked up from his work, frowning. "Sounds like trouble," the storekeeper muttered. Luke moved to the window and peered through the frost-etched glass. A crowd had gathered in the street, forming a loose circle around something he couldn't quite see. Their voices carried the particular tone people used when confronted with tragedy, hushed, urgent, tinged with the morbid curiosity that drew folks toward disasters like moths to flame. "Should go see what's happening," Morrison said, but made no move to leave his counter. Luke felt the familiar urge to mind his own business, to collect his supplies and return to the safety of his mountain sanctuary. But something about the crowd's behavior nagged at him, the way they stood back, keeping their distance from whatever lay at their center, as if witnessing something they felt obligated to see but powerless to address. Against his better judgment, he stepped outside. The crowd parted slightly as he approached, recognizing him despite his infrequent visits. Luke was a head taller than most men and carried himself with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to depending entirely on his own judgment. People moved aside without thinking about it. What he saw in the center of that circle would haunt him for the rest of his life. A woman lay unconscious in the street, her dark hair matted with blood from a wound above her left temple. Her clothes, once fine, now torn and stained, marked her as someone who'd fallen far from whatever station she once held. Her breathing came in shallow gasps that sent small puffs of vapor into the frigid air. Standing over her, like a guardian angel with bare feet and chattering teeth, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old, small for her age, with auburn hair that caught the weak sunlight and eyes the color of summer sage. Her dress was too thin for the weather, and her feet, dear God, her feet were bare against the frozen ground, the skin red and swollen with the early stages of frostbite. But it was her expression that stopped Luke's heart. The child's face showed no fear, no tears, no childish confusion. Instead, she wore the determined look of someone prepared to die, defending what she loved most. Her small hands were clenched into fists, and she stood between her fallen mother and the crowd with the fierce protectiveness of a she-wolf guarding her cubs. "Someone needs to get Doc Harrison," a voice called from the crowd. "Doc's up at the Whitmore mine," another replied. "Won't be back till evening. Can't leave them lying in the street. Ain't our problem. They're not from here. Still, a Christian ought to. You want to take responsibility for them. Feel free." Luke found himself stepping forward before conscious thought could stop him. The little girl's gaze snapped to him, her jaw setting with stubborn resolve. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the cold air. "Please, mister, save my mother." She paused, swallowing hard, then spoke words that shattered something deep in Luke's chest. "I'll do anything you want." The crowd fell silent. Luke stared at the child, at her bare feet in the snow, at her mother's labored breathing, at the desperate courage in those sage-green eyes, and felt the carefully constructed walls around his heart begin to crumble. 16 years of solitude, 16 years of telling himself that caring led only to loss, that the safest path was the lonely one. But this child, this brave little soul, offering to trade herself for her mother's life, looked so much like Lily that Luke's vision blurred with unexpected tears. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Emma," she replied, never taking her eyes from his face. "Emma Bradley. And my mama's Sarah. She's hurt real bad, but she's strong. She just needs help." Luke knelt beside Sarah Bradley, his practiced eye taking in her injuries. The head wound looked worse than it was scalp cuts, always bled heavily, but her breathing concerned him. Shallow, irregular, the sound of lungs working too hard. Her pulse was thready beneath his fingers. "How long has she been like this?" he asked Emma. "Since this morning. We were walking, and she just fell down and wouldn't wake up." Emma's composure cracked slightly. "I tried to carry her, but she's too heavy. I stayed with her so nobody would hurt her while she sleeps." Luke's jaw tightened. This child had stood guard over her unconscious mother for hours in freezing weather, sacrificing her own safety for someone she loved. The strength it must have taken, the devotion. "Help me get her inside Morrison's store," he said to the crowd. "She needs warmth." "Now, hold on," someone objected. "You can't just—" Luke's head snapped up, his grey eyes blazing with an intensity that made grown men step backward. Anyone got an objection to helping a sick woman and a freezing child? The silence that followed was answer enough. Luke lifted Sarah Bradley as gently as he could manage, surprised by how light she felt in his arms. Emma followed close behind, her bare feet leaving small, bloody prints in the snow, a sight that made Luke's chest tighten with rage at a world that could be so cruel to innocence. Inside Morrison's store, they made a bed of blankets near the pot-bellied stove. Sarah's breathing eased slightly in the warmth, though she remained unconscious. Luke examined her injuries more thoroughly, finding bruises on her arms and ribs that suggested a fall or worse. "Emma," he said softly, "do you remember how your mama got hurt?" The child hesitated, fear flickering across her face for the first time since he'd found her. "There were men," she whispered. "Bad men who came to our camp last night. Mama told me to run and hide, but I saw them hit her. They were looking for something." "What kind of something?" "I don't know. Papers, maybe? Mama always kept papers in her bag. Said they were important." Emma's lower lip trembled. "After the men left, I went to Mama, but she wouldn't wake up. I didn't know what else to do except come to town for help." Luke felt the familiar stirring of protective anger, the same emotion that had once driven him to track down the Comanche raiders who'd destroyed his family. But this time, the feeling came mixed with something else, a warmth he'd thought died 16 years ago. Emma was shivering despite the store's heat, her thin dress offering little protection. Without thinking, Luke shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her small shoulders. It swallowed her completely, the sleeves hanging past her hands, but the child's expression of grateful wonder made his throat constrict. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling the coat tight around herself. "You're very kind." Kind. When was the last time someone had called him that? When was the last time he'd done something that deserved the word? Morrison approached with a cup of hot coffee, which Emma accepted with both hands, sipping carefully and sighing with relief as the warmth spread through her body. "What are you planning to do with them?" the storekeeper asked Luke quietly. Luke looked down at Sarah Bradley's pale face, then at Emma, who was watching her mother with the fierce attention of someone willing her loved one to heal through sheer force of will. The sensible thing would be to wait for Doc Harrison, make sure they were settled somewhere safe, then return to his mountain refuge. These people weren't his responsibility. He had his own ghosts to wrestle with, his own peace to preserve. But as he watched Emma reach over to touch her mother's forehead, with a tenderness that spoke of years spent caring for each other, Luke heard Martha's voice from across the years. "A man's character isn't measured by what he does for himself, Luke. It's measured by what he does for those who can't help themselves. He'd failed that test once. He wouldn't fail it again." "I'll take them up to my place," he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "They'll be safe there until she recovers." Emma looked up at him with an expression of such pure gratitude that Luke felt something shift deep in his chest, a door opening after years of being barred shut. "You'd do that for us?" she asked. Luke nodded, not trusting his voice. He was committed now, for better or worse. The lone bear was about to have company for the first time in 16 years, and God help him, he was terrified. The journey to Luke's cabin proved more treacherous than he'd anticipated. Sarah Bradley remained unconscious, her breathing growing shallower with each mile they climbed. Luke had fashioned a travois from pine poles and blankets, securing her as gently as possible, but the rough mountain terrain made every jolt a potential disaster. Emma rode behind him on Ryder, her small arms wrapped around his waist, still drowning in his heavy coat. She hadn't complained once during the 4-hour ascent, though Luke could feel her shivering against his back. The child's resilience amazed him. Most adults would have been whimpering with cold and fear by now. "How much farther?" she asked as they paused to rest the horse. "Another hour, maybe less." Luke checked the travois straps, ensuring Sarah remained secure. Her face had taken on a waxy pallor that worried him. "Your mama's a fighter, Emma. She's going to pull through this." "I know," Emma said with quiet confidence. "Mama's the strongest person I ever knew. She's had to be." Something in the child's tone made Luke look at her more closely. "What do you mean?" Emma hesitated, then seemed to decide he could be trusted. After Papa died, it was just me and Mama. She had to learn to do everything: hunt, fish, fix things when they broke. She said we couldn't depend on anybody else because people would always let you down. Luke felt an uncomfortable recognition in those words. Your papa, how did he die? Bad men shot him. Emma's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone children used when discussing tragedies they didn't fully understand. Mama said he was trying to help people, but the bad men didn't want him to. They came to our house one night and... She stopped, her small body tensing with the memory. You don't have to talk about it, Luke said gently. Mama made me hide under the floor. I heard the shooting, and then the bad men were looking for something. They tore up our house, but they didn't find what they wanted. After they left, Mama said we had to go away and never come back. Luke's jaw tightened. The picture Emma painted was disturbingly familiar, the same pattern of violence that had shattered his own family. Someone hunting for something specific, willing to kill for it. They resumed the climb, Sarah's condition weighing heavily on Luke's mind. By the time they reached his cabin, the sun had disappeared behind the western peaks, and the temperature was dropping fast. Luke carried Sarah inside, while Emma followed, her eyes wide as she took in her first real home in months. The cabin was spartanly furnished, but solid, one large room with a sleeping alcove, a stone fireplace, and shelves lined with books. Luke had built it to last, using techniques his father had taught him back in Missouri. The walls were chinked tight against the wind, and the roof was stout enough to bear the weight of heavy snow. Luke settled Sarah on his own bed, piling blankets over her still form. Her breathing remained irregular, and when he lifted her eyelids, her pupils were different sizes, a sign that concerned him greatly. Is there anything I can do to help? Emma asked, standing beside the bed with anxious eyes. Keep talking to her, Luke suggested. Sometimes people who are sleeping real deep can still hear voices they love. Emma climbed onto the bed beside her mother, taking Sarah's cold hand in both of her own. I'm here, Mama, she whispered. I found help, just like you taught me. This is Mr. Luke, and he's going to take care of us until you get better. Luke busied himself building up the fire and preparing a thin broth from dried beef and vegetables. As he worked, he listened to Emma's gentle chatter stories about their travels, memories of better times, promises about all the things they would do together when Sarah woke up. The child's devotion was both heartbreaking and inspiring. She never left her mother's side except when absolutely necessary, and even then she kept up a steady stream of conversation, as if her voice alone could call Sarah back from whatever dark place she wandered. On the second day, Sarah's fever broke, but she remained unconscious. Luke was beginning to fear permanent damage when Emma made a discovery that changed everything. Mr. Luke, she called from beside the bed, her voice tight with worry. Mama's bag is gone. Luke looked up from the stew he was stirring. What bag? The one she always carried. It had her important papers in it, the ones Papa told her to keep safe. Emma's face had gone pale. She never went anywhere without it. Never. Luke felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. Emma, think carefully. When did you last see this bag? The night the bad men came to our camp. Mama had it with her when she told me to hide. Emma's eyes widened with understanding. They took it, didn't they? That's what they were looking for. Probably. Luke set down his spoon and moved to the window, scanning the tree line out of habit. Tell me about these papers. Do you know what was in them? Emma nodded slowly. Papa was a marshal, and he found out about bad things some important men were doing. He wrote it all down and told Mama to hide the papers where nobody could find them. He said if anything happened to him, she should take them to someone who could make the bad men pay for their crimes. Luke's blood ran cold. Marshal Bradley, he'd heard that name before, whispered in saloons and around campfires. A lawman who'd been getting too close to something big before he turned up dead. If Sarah had evidence of corruption involving powerful men, that would explain why they were being hunted. Emma, he said carefully, do you think these men might come looking for you and your mama? The child's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded. Mama said they would never stop looking. That's why we had to keep moving, keep hiding. But now they have the papers, so maybe they'll leave us alone. Luke doubted it. Men who killed to protect their secrets didn't leave witnesses alive, especially witnesses who could identify them. The fact that Sarah and Emma were still breathing meant the killers either hadn't found them yet, or were saving them for last. As if summoned by his thoughts, Ryder whinnied nervously from the corral outside. Luke moved to the window again, his hand instinctively reaching for the Winchester beside the door. The horse's ears were pricked forward, staring down the mountain trail with the alertness that meant visitors. "Emma," Luke said quietly, "I need you to do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that?" The child heard the urgency in his voice and nodded, wiping her tears. "Take your mama's hand and keep talking to her, just like you've been doing. If I tell you to hide, you get under the bed and don't come out until I say it's safe. Understand?" "Are they coming?" Emma whispered. "I don't know. Maybe." Luke checked his weapons with practiced efficiency. "But if they are, I won't let them hurt you or your mama. I promise." The sound of hoofbeats drifted up from the valley, multiple horses moving at a steady pace. Luke counted at least 4 riders, possibly more. In his 16 years on the mountain, he'd never had 4 visitors at once. Coincidences like that didn't exist in his world. Through the window, he watched them emerge from the tree line, 5 men on horseback, dressed in the nondescript clothing of drifters, but carrying themselves with the purposeful bearing of professionals. The leader was a big man, with a graying beard and cold eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of Luke's property. Luke recognized the type. He'd fought alongside men like these during his cavalry days, and against them during his time as a scout. They were killers, plain and simple, the kind who took money to solve other people's problems with violence. The riders approached openly, making no attempt at stealth. They knew he was watching, knew he was armed, and didn't seem particularly concerned about either fact. That level of confidence suggested they either had superior numbers, superior firepower, or information that made them believe they held all the advantages. Luke stepped onto his front porch, the Winchester held casually but ready. "That's far enough," he called when the riders were still 30 yards away. The leader raised his hand, stopping his men. "Afternoon," he said in a voice like gravel in a tin cup. "We're looking for a woman and a little girl. Heard you might have seen them." "Lots of women and children in these parts," Luke replied evenly. "You'll have to be more specific." The man's smile was cold as winter wind. "Dark-haired woman, maybe 25, traveling with a girl about 9 years old. They stole something valuable from our employer. We're here to get it back. Haven't seen anybody like that." "Now, that's interesting." The leader's hand moved closer to his gun. "Because we tracked them right up this mountain, and there ain't nowhere else they could have gone." Luke's finger found the Winchester's trigger. "Tracking's unreliable in snow country. Easy to lose a trail. Maybe. Or maybe you're lying to protect a thief and her brat." The words hit Luke like a physical blow. These men had no idea who they were dealing with. No understanding of the line they'd just crossed. The protective rage that had once driven him across half of Missouri in pursuit of Comanche raiders began to build in his chest. "I think it's time for you gentlemen to move along," Luke said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The leader laughed. "5 against 1, mountain man. Those ain't good odds for you. Depends on how you count." Before the man could ask what that meant, Luke's rifle spoke. The bullet took the leader's hat clean off his head, parting his hair in the process. The riders' horses reared and danced as their owners fought for control. "Next one won't miss," Luke announced calmly, already working the Winchester's lever. "And the one after that won't either. I can put 5 shots in a playing card at 100 yards. You boys are a lot bigger than a playing card." The riders exchanged uncertain glances. They'd expected to intimidate a simple mountain hermit, not face down a marksman who could part a man's hair from 30 yards. "This ain't over," the leader snarled, settling his damaged hat back on his head. No, Luke agreed. It's not, but it will be soon. The riders wheeled their horses and rode back down the mountain, but Luke knew they wouldn't go far. Men like that didn't give up easily, especially when their reputation was at stake. They'd be back, probably after dark, and next time they wouldn't announce their presence. Luke stepped back inside to find Emma watching him with wide eyes. "They were the bad men, weren't they?" she asked. "Yes," Luke said simply. There was no point in lying to her. "Are they going to come back?" "Probably." Emma nodded gravely, then returned to her mother's bedside. "It's okay, Mama," she whispered. "Mr. Luke scared them away. He's going to protect us." Luke wished he felt as confident as the child sounded. 5 against 1 were indeed poor odds, and these men wouldn't make the mistake of underestimating him twice. But as he looked at Emma's trusting face and Sarah's vulnerable form, Luke felt something stir inside him that had been dormant for 16 years. He'd failed to protect his family once. He wouldn't fail again. Luke spent the remainder of daylight preparing for the inevitable return of their unwelcome visitors. He moved with the methodical precision of a man who understood that survival often depended on attention to the smallest details, checking sight lines, positioning extra ammunition, and ensuring every approach to the cabin could be covered by rifle fire. Emma watched his preparations with solemn attention, never asking questions that might distract him from his work. The child's intuitive understanding of danger impressed Luke. She seemed to grasp that their situation was serious, without needing explicit explanations. As the sun disappeared behind the western peaks, Luke brought his spare blankets to the main room and made a bed near the fireplace. "You and your mama will sleep here tonight," he told Emma. "It's warmer, and—" he paused, not wanting to frighten her further. "And it's safer," Emma finished for him, "because the bedroom has windows they could shoot through." Luke nodded, surprised by her perceptiveness. "You're a smart girl, Emma Bradley. Mama taught me to pay attention to things. She said staying alive means thinking ahead." Emma helped him arrange the blankets with the careful attention of someone accustomed to making do with whatever was available. "Will they really come back tonight?" "I think so. Men like that don't like being embarrassed in front of their friends." "Are you scared?" The question caught Luke off guard. Was he scared? He examined his feelings honestly, finding a complex mixture of anticipation, anger, and something else, a fierce protectiveness that reminded him of how he'd felt watching his children sleep in their beds back in Missouri. "I'm concerned," he said finally, "but not scared. I've been in situations like this before." "When you were a soldier?" Luke glanced at her sharply. "How did you know I was a soldier?" Emma smiled for the first time since he'd known her. "You move like Papa did, and you check corners and doorways without thinking about it. Papa said only soldiers and lawmen learn to do that." The child's observational skills were remarkable. Luke made a mental note not to underestimate her intelligence. "Your papa sounds like he was a good man." "He was the best man in the world," Emma said with absolute conviction, "until I met you." The simple statement hit Luke harder than he'd expected. He turned away, ostensibly to check the rifle again, but really to hide the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. When had anyone last spoken of him with such trust? "Emma," he said carefully, "I want you to understand something. I'm going to do everything I can to keep you and your mama safe. But if something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," Emma interrupted with startling firmness. "But if it does—" "It won't." The child's voice carried an adult's certainty. "You're not going to leave us. I can tell." Luke found himself speechless. How could a 9-year-old child read him so clearly when he barely understood his own motivations? They moved Sarah to the main room together, Luke carrying her slight form, while Emma fussed with pillows and blankets. Sarah's breathing had improved slightly, though she remained unconscious. Luke was beginning to wonder if her condition was more than just a head injury. "Emma," he said as they settled Sarah near the fireplace, "did your mama hit her head when she fell, or did the men hurt her?" Emma's face darkened. "One of them hit her with something, a stick or maybe a gun. She tried to fight them, but there were too many. The child's small fists clenched. I wanted to help her, but she made me promise to stay hidden no matter what happened. Luke felt the familiar burn of rage in his chest. Men who would strike a woman defending her child deserved whatever violence found them. You did right, Emma. Your mama was protecting you the only way she could. I know, but I still felt like a coward. Bravery isn't about fighting when you're strong enough to win, Luke said, thinking of his own daughter's courage in their final moments. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you're scared. You've been braver than most grown men I've known. Emma's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Really? Really? Your mama's going to be very proud when she wakes up. They ate a simple supper of beans and hardtack, Emma managing only a few bites despite Luke's encouragement. As darkness settled over the mountain, Luke extinguished all but one lamp and positioned himself near a window that commanded the best view of the approach trail. "Try to get some sleep," he told Emma. "I'll keep watch." But the child showed no inclination toward rest. Instead, she sat beside her mother, one small hand resting on Sarah's arm, as if her touch alone could call the woman back to consciousness. Luke found himself studying Emma's profile in the lamplight, noting the determined set of her jaw and the protective way she positioned herself between her mother and the door. The resemblance to his own Lily was superficial, different coloring, different features, but something in the child's spirit reminded him powerfully of his daughter. Lily had possessed that same fierce loyalty, that same instinctive understanding of right and wrong. She'd defended her little brother against playground bullies twice her size, and she'd never backed down from a fight when principles were at stake. The memory brought both comfort and pain. Luke had spent 16 years trying not to think about his children, but Emma's presence was awakening feelings he'd thought buried forever. "Mr. Luke," Emma's soft voice pulled him from his reverie. "Yes? When Mama wakes up, will you teach me to shoot?" The question surprised him. That's not something little girls usually need to know. "I'm not a usual little girl," Emma replied with matter-of-fact honesty. "Bad things happen to people I love, and I want to be able to help protect them." Luke considered her request. In his world, survival often depended on the ability to defend oneself, and Emma had already proven she possessed the temperament for difficult decisions. Perhaps it would be wise to give her tools to protect herself and her mother. "We'll see," he said finally. "First, let's get through tonight." The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Luke divided his attention between watching the approaches to his cabin and listening to Emma's whispered conversations with her unconscious mother. The child told stories about their travels, shared memories of her father, and made plans for the future with an optimism that broke Luke's heart. Near midnight, Ryder's soft whinny alerted Luke to movement in the darkness. He pressed his face to the window, scanning the moonlit landscape for signs of their pursuers. The snow-covered ground made concealment difficult, but professional killers knew how to use shadows and terrain to their advantage. There, a flicker of movement near the tree line, barely visible against the dark pines. Luke counted at least 3 figures, creeping toward the cabin from different directions. The coordinated approach confirmed his assessment of their opponent's capabilities. "Emma," he whispered, "get under the bed with your mama. Don't come out until I tell you." The child obeyed instantly, helping to pull Sarah into the shelter Luke had prepared. Her calm acceptance of the danger impressed him once again. Most children would have been crying or asking questions, but Emma simply nodded and disappeared into the shadows. Luke positioned himself at the window with the Winchester ready, his senses heightened by years of experience in similar situations. The attackers were being careful, taking their time to establish positions before making their move. They'd learned respect for his marksmanship during their afternoon encounter. The first shot came without warning, a rifle bullet that shattered the window beside Luke's head, sending glass fragments across the room. Luke rolled away from the opening and took cover behind his heavy wooden table, which he'd positioned earlier for exactly this purpose. "Calder," the leader's voice carried clearly through the broken window. Send out the woman and girl, and we'll let you live." Luke's response was a rifle shot that punched through the cabin's front door at chest height. He was rewarded by a startled curse from outside. "You're outnumbered," the voice continued. "This doesn't have to end badly for you." "Already ended badly for you," Luke called back, working the Winchester's lever. "Question is how much worse you want to make it." More shots peppered the cabin's walls, forcing Luke to keep his head down. The attackers were using sound tactics, maintaining continuous fire to pin him in place while maneuvering for better positions. Luke counted muzzle flashes and tried to determine their exact locations. From under the bed, he could hear Emma whispering urgently to her mother. The child's voice remained calm despite the gunfire, and Luke felt a surge of pride at her courage. A shadow passed by the broken window, and Luke sent a quick shot in its direction. The shadow dropped and didn't move again. 4 left, assuming his count was accurate. The gunfire intensified, bullets splintering the cabin's thick walls and sending wood chips flying. Luke's stone fireplace provided good cover, but he couldn't stay pinned down indefinitely. Sooner or later they'd rush him, and 5 against 1 were still poor odds in close quarters. Time to change the dynamic. Luke had built his cabin with defense in mind, including features his attackers couldn't know about. He crawled to a section of wall that looked identical to the rest, but concealed a narrow firing port he'd cut during construction. Pushing aside a carefully positioned board, he found himself with a clear shot at 2 men positioned behind his woodpile. The Winchester spoke twice in rapid succession. 2 more shadows stopped moving. "Son of a—" The leader's voice carried a note of surprise and growing anger. "Where are you, you bastard?" Luke smiled grimly. 2 down, 3 to go, and his opponents were beginning to lose their professional composure. Angry men made mistakes, and mistakes got you killed in situations like this. But as he repositioned for another shot, Luke heard something that chilled his blood, the soft sound of someone moving on the cabin's roof. One of them was trying to come down the chimney. Luke moved quickly but quietly toward the fireplace, his mind racing through options. The fire was burning low, but still hot enough to discourage anyone foolish enough to attempt a descent. However, a determined killer might risk burns to gain access to the cabin. The scratching sounds from above grew more pronounced, someone definitely working to remove the metal cap from his chimney. Luke positioned himself where he could watch both the fireplace and the broken window, the Winchester ready for either threat. "Emma," he whispered urgently, "stay exactly where you are, no matter what happens." A muffled response came from under the bed, followed by what sounded like Sarah stirring. Luke's heart leaped with hope. If Sarah was regaining consciousness, it would give Emma someone to comfort her through whatever came next. More gunfire erupted from outside, but this time Luke detected a change in the pattern. The shots were coming from only 2 positions now, confirming that he'd reduced their numbers significantly. The remaining attackers were keeping him pinned while their companion attempted his rooftop approach. Luke heard the metal cap clatter to the ground outside, followed by the scrape of boots against stone. The man was committed now. There was no quiet way to retreat back up a chimney. The fire suddenly dimmed as something blocked the light from above. Luke raised his rifle toward the opening, finger tense on the trigger. If the intruder dropped straight down, he'd land in the fire itself. If he tried to lower himself carefully, he'd present a perfect target. A pair of boots appeared at the top of the fireplace opening, followed by legs encased in dark trousers. The man was attempting to ease himself down slowly, using his hands to grip the chimney walls. Luke waited until the intruder's torso became visible, then spoke quietly. "I wouldn't come any further if I were you." The man froze, his face now visible in the firelight, a lean, scarred individual with the cold eyes of a professional killer. "Calder," he said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be." "Seems easy enough to me," Luke replied, keeping the rifle trained on the man's center mass. "You're stuck in my chimney, and I'm about to shoot you. My partners have explosives." the killer said calmly. "They'll blow this whole cabin apart if I don't signal them soon." "Then you'd better hope you can signal from the afterlife." Before the man could respond, Luke squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar filled the cabin as the bullet took the intruder in the chest, sending him tumbling back up the chimney with a strangled cry. The gunfire from outside immediately intensified, and Luke heard angry shouting as the remaining attackers realized their companion's fate. 2 left now, but the leader's earlier threat about explosives concerned him. These men seemed prepared for a protracted siege. "Mama?" Emma's voice carried clearly despite the ongoing gunfire. "Mama, are you awake?" Luke's attention snapped toward the bed. Sarah Bradley was indeed stirring, her eyes fluttering open for the first time in 3 days. Despite the immediate danger, Luke felt a surge of relief. The woman's recovery meant Emma wouldn't be alone if the worst happened. "Where?" Sarah's voice was weak but coherent. "Emma, where are we?" "We're safe, Mama," Emma whispered urgently. "Mr. Luke is protecting us, but there are bad men outside trying to hurt us." Sarah's eyes widened with alarm as awareness returned. She struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain in her head. "The papers, did they get the papers?" "Yes, Mama, they took your bag." Sarah's face crumpled with despair. "Then Tom died for nothing, all those people he was trying to help." "The papers aren't important right now," Luke interrupted, risking a glance toward the bed. "What's important is keeping you and Emma alive." Sarah focused on him for the first time, taking in his weathered face and the rifle in his hands. "You're the man who helped us," Emma told me. She paused as another volley of shots peppered the cabin walls. "How many are there?" 2 left, Luke said grimly, "but they're not giving up easy." Sarah struggled to her feet despite Emma's protests, swaying slightly but determined to remain upright. "I won't cower under a bed while someone risks his life for us." Luke admired her spirit, but he needed her to stay safe. "Ma'am, with respect, you've been unconscious for 3 days. You're in no condition to—" "I'm in condition to think," Sarah interrupted firmly, "and right now we need to think our way out of this." A new sound from outside caught Luke's attention, the whinny of horses being moved into position. The remaining attackers were repositioning, probably preparing for a final assault. "They're going to rush us," Luke said, checking his ammunition. "I can hold them off for a while, but—" "No," Sarah said with sudden determination. "There's another way." She moved unsteadily toward Luke's bookshelf, her eyes scanning the titles with desperate intensity. "You have law books, legal precedents. That means you understand justice." Luke frowned, confused by her apparent change of subject. "Ma'am, this isn't the time for—" "It's exactly the time." Sarah pulled a leather-bound volume from the shelf and opened it to reveal a hollowed-out compartment. Inside were several folded papers, protected by oilcloth. Tom wasn't the only one who kept evidence hidden. Luke stared in amazement. "You have copies of the documents?" "Better. I have the originals." Sarah's smile was fierce despite her obvious pain. What those men took was bait copies Tom made to draw attention away from the real evidence. Emma gasped with delight. "Mama, you're so clever." "Your papa taught me to think like a lawman," Sarah said, carefully rewrapping the documents. "Always have a backup plan, and never put all your evidence in one place." The implications of Sarah's revelation hit Luke immediately. If these papers can prove corruption, then there are people in authority who would want to see them. The territorial governor, the federal marshal in Cheyenne, maybe even senators in Washington, Sarah confirmed. "But first, we have to survive long enough to deliver them." Outside, the gunfire had stopped. Luke moved cautiously to the window, scanning the moonlit landscape for signs of movement. The sudden silence was more ominous than the shooting had been. "They're planning something," he muttered. As if summoned by his words, the leader's voice carried across the clearing. "Calder, we know you're listening. We've got dynamite, and we're going to blow that cabin to splinters if you don't send out the woman and girl in the next 5 minutes." Luke's jaw tightened. The threat might be real men like this, often carried explosives for situations exactly like this one. but surrendering Sarah and Emma would mean signing their death warrants. "What do we do?" Emma asked, her voice small but steady. Luke looked at the child's trusting face, then at Sarah's determined expression. These weren't his family, weren't his responsibility. He could fight his way out alone, leave them to their fate, and return to his solitary existence on the mountain. But as he considered that option, Luke realized something fundamental had changed inside him. The protective instincts he'd thought died with his own family were very much alive, focused now on this brave woman and her remarkable daughter. "We're not giving up," he said firmly, "and we're not dying here tonight." "Then what?" Sarah asked. Luke moved to his gun cabinet and withdrew items he hadn't touched in years: a cavalry saber, a pair of Colt revolvers, and a leather bandolier of ammunition. "We're going to do something they won't expect." "What's that?" Luke's smile was cold as winter wind. "We're going to attack them." Emma's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and excitement. "All of us?" "All of us," Luke confirmed, checking the revolver's cylinders. "Your mama has evidence that needs to reach the right people. I have the skills to get us out of here alive. And you," he looked at Emma seriously, "you have the courage to do whatever needs to be done." Sarah struggled to her feet, still unsteady but determined. "What do you need us to do?" Luke outlined his plan quickly. It was desperate, risky, and depended on split-second timing. But it was better than waiting for dynamite to reduce his cabin to kindling. "Can you handle a gun?" he asked Sarah. "Tom taught me to shoot," she replied. "I'm not expert, but I can hit what I aim at." Luke handed her one of the revolvers. "Don't aim unless you intend to kill. These men showed no mercy to your husband, and they'll show none to you." Sarah's face hardened with resolve. "They killed my Tom. They tried to kill my daughter. I understand exactly what kind of mercy they deserve." Outside, the leader called again. 3 minutes, Calder, then we light the fuse." Luke moved to his supply cabinet and withdrew several items that made Emma gasp, with surprise small bundles that looked like oversized firecrackers. "What are those?" she whispered. "Blasting charges," Luke explained. "I used them to clear rocks when I built this place. Tonight, they're going to help clear out some different kind of vermin." He quickly explained each person's role in his plan. Sarah would provide covering fire from the cabin's front door, while Luke circled around to flank their attackers. Emma's job was the most dangerous and the most crucial. "I can do it," the child said when Luke finished explaining. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Luke replied, surprised by his complete confidence in her abilities. As they prepared to execute their desperate gambit, Luke found himself thinking about the photograph hidden in his cabin wall, Martha, Lily, and Samuel, smiling across the years. They would have liked Emma Bradley, he realized. His daughter especially would have admired the younger girl's courage. "Ready?" he asked. Sarah and Emma nodded together, the resemblance between mother and daughter obvious in their shared determination. Luke took a deep breath, feeling more alive than he had in 16 years. "Then let's go save ourselves." Luke slipped out the cabin's back door while Sarah and Emma took their positions. The night air cut through his shirt like a blade, but years of mountain living had taught him to ignore discomfort when survival was at stake. Moving with practiced stealth, he began his flanking maneuver through the trees. The snow muffled his footsteps, but also made tracking easier for anyone who knew what to look for. Luke followed a path he'd used for hunting, staying within the tree line where shadows would conceal his movement. His cavalry training from 20 years ago felt as fresh as yesterday. The ability to move silently through enemy territory was not a skill that rusted with disuse. From his new position, Luke could see both remaining attackers. They'd taken cover behind a fallen tree about 50 yards from the cabin, and one of them was indeed preparing what looked like dynamite. The fuse gleamed dully in the moonlight as the man worked to attach it to several bundled sticks. Luke checked his pocket watch, 2 minutes until their ultimatum expired. Sarah and Emma were counting on his timing to be perfect. One mistake would get them all killed. Inside the cabin, Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside the front door, the revolver heavy in her still weak hands. The head injury had left her with occasional dizzy spells, but her vision was clear and her resolve absolute. These men had murdered her husband and terrorized her daughter. Whatever happened tonight, she would not go quietly. Emma crouched near the fireplace, clutching one of Luke's blasting charges as if it were a precious treasure. The child's face showed no fear, only concentration, as she waited for the signal that would begin their desperate gambit. 1 minute, the leader shouted from outside. Then we blow you all to hell. Sarah caught Emma's eye and nodded reassuringly. The plan Luke had outlined was dangerous, but it offered their only real chance of survival. Waiting passively for these killers to act would ensure their deaths. Outside, Luke positioned himself 30 yards behind the attacker's fallen log. He could hear them talking in low, urgent voices as they made final preparations for their assault. The one with the dynamite was having trouble with the fuse it kept going out in the cold mountain air. "Just light the damn thing and throw it," his companion hissed. "We've wasted enough time on this fool." "Fuse is wet," the first man replied. "Give me another minute to—" Luke didn't give him another minute. Rising from concealment, he fired both revolvers simultaneously. The first shot took the man with the dynamite in the back, sending him sprawling across his explosive device. The second shot spun his companion around, clutching a shattered shoulder. The wounded man tried to bring his rifle to bear, but Sarah's covering fire from the cabin door forced him back behind the log. Her first shot splintered wood inches from his head, followed by a second that ricocheted off the frozen ground beside him. "Now, Emma!" Luke shouted. The child stood and hurled the blasting charge with all her strength. It arced through the air like a small comet, landing directly behind the fallen tree where the surviving attacker cowered. Luke had lit the fuse before giving Emma the charge, timing it to explode seconds after impact. The blast lit up the mountainside like dawn, sending chunks of wood and frozen earth flying in all directions. When the smoke cleared, the threat was over. Luke approached the scene cautiously, revolvers ready, but found no signs of life among the scattered debris. 5 men had come to his mountain seeking victims. None would return to report their failure. Sarah emerged from the cabin, supporting herself against the doorframe as Emma ran to Luke's side. The child threw her arms around his waist, her composure finally cracking as relief overwhelmed her. "Is it over?" she asked through tears. "It's over," Luke confirmed, holstering his weapons. "They won't hurt anyone ever again." Sarah made her way across the clearing on unsteady legs, the precious documents clutched against her chest. "The evidence is safe," she said. "Tom's sacrifice wasn't in vain." Luke helped her back to the cabin, noting how pale she'd become. The night's excitement had drained what little strength she'd regained. "You need rest," he said gently. "We all need rest," Sarah replied. "But first, we need to talk about what comes next." Inside the warm cabin, they sat around the fireplace while Luke prepared coffee and Sarah examined the documents she'd hidden in his law book. Emma curled up beside her mother, finally allowing exhaustion to claim her. "These papers contain evidence of corruption reaching all the way to the territorial capital," Sarah explained, her voice growing stronger as she focused on her husband's work. "Tom discovered that a syndicate of politicians and businessmen has been stealing federal money intended for Indian reservations, using it to buy mining rights and railroad land." Luke frowned. "That's a serious accusation." "It's more than an accusation, it's documented fact." Tom gathered testimony from Indian agents, bank records, even correspondence between the conspirators. Sarah's eyes blazed with determination. "But the syndicate has men everywhere. That's why they were able to kill Tom and make it look like a random attack. And why they've been hunting you," Luke added. "They can't afford to let this evidence reach honest authorities. Too many powerful men would fall." Luke studied the papers Sarah showed him, recognizing names he'd heard mentioned in political circles. If even half of what Marshall Bradley had documented was true, it represented one of the largest corruption scandals in the territory's history. "What do you plan to do with this?" he asked. "Take it to someone who can act on it, the federal marshal in Cheyenne, or maybe the territorial governor himself." Luke shook his head. "If this conspiracy reaches as high as you think, those men might be compromised too. You need someone above suspicion, someone with the authority to investigate federal crimes." Sarah's face fell. "Then who?" "Tom spent months trying to find someone he could trust, and it got him killed." "There's a man in Denver," Luke said slowly. "Federal Judge Harrison Blackwood. He has a reputation for absolute honesty, and he's not beholden to local political interests. Do you know him?" Luke hesitated, then decided honesty was required. "I served under his son during the war. Captain James Blackwood was the finest officer I ever knew. He spoke often about his father's dedication to justice." James died at Antietam, but his father still sends me a letter every Christmas, asking after my welfare." Luke's voice softened with memory. "He's a good man, Sarah. If anyone can ensure this evidence reaches the right people, it's Judge Blackwood." Sarah studied Luke's face carefully. "You're not just a mountain hermit, are you? I was a lot of things before I came to this mountain. Some of them I'm proud of, some I'm not. But you know people who can help us." "I know people who can help you," Luke corrected. "This evidence needs to reach Denver, but I don't have to be the one who takes it there." Sarah's expression hardened. "You're thinking of leaving us." "I'm thinking of keeping you safe. Those 5 men weren't the only ones looking for you. When they don't report back, others will come. Then we'll face them together." "Sarah." "No." Her voice carried absolute finality. "You saved our lives tonight. You gave us hope when we had none. I won't let you retreat back to your mountain while Emma and I face this alone." Emma stirred in her mother's arms, awakening at the sound of raised voices. "What's wrong?" she asked sleepily. "Nothing's wrong," Sarah said firmly, her eyes never leaving Luke's face. "Mr. Luke was just explaining how he's going to help us take Papa's evidence to the right people." Luke started to protest, but Emma's trusting gaze stopped him. The child looked at him with absolute confidence that he would do the right thing, and Luke felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "It's dangerous," he said finally. "The journey to Denver, the people we'll face, it's not a trip for a woman and child." "I've been running and hiding for months," Sarah replied. "I'm tired of being afraid. It's time to fight back." Luke looked at the 2 faces, watching him expectantly, Sarah's fierce with determination, Emma's bright with hope, and realized he'd already made his decision. The moment he'd chosen to help them, he'd committed himself to seeing it through. "Denver it is," he said quietly. Emma's smile could have lit the entire mountainside. "But we do this my way," Luke continued. "No unnecessary risks, no heroic gestures. We get the evidence to Judge Blackwood and let the law handle the rest." "Agreed," Sarah said immediately. "And we leave tomorrow. The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it becomes." Sarah nodded, though Luke could see the prospect of travel worried her. She was still weak from her injuries, and the journey to Denver would be grueling under the best circumstances. "I can make it," she said, reading his expression. "I have to make it." Luke hoped she was right. The road ahead would test them all in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But as he watched Emma drift back to sleep in her mother's arms, Luke felt something he hadn't experienced in 16 years, a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. Tomorrow, they would begin a journey that would either see justice served or get them all killed, trying. Either way, Luke Calder was no longer alone. Dawn broke grey and cold over the mountain, with storm clouds gathering on the western horizon. Luke had been awake since before first light, preparing for their departure while Sarah and Emma slept. The journey to Denver would take at least a week through country that grew more dangerous with each mile they descended towards civilization. Luke packed methodically, his military experience guiding him to choose only essential items. Food for 10 days, ammunition, medical supplies, and warm clothing took priority over comfort. He wrapped Marshal Bradley's evidence in oilcloth and placed it in a specially padded saddlebag, designed to protect valuable items from weather and rough handling. Sarah awakened as he loaded the last of their supplies onto a pack horse he'd brought in from his small herd. Her color was better this morning, though she still moved carefully, testing her balance before taking each step. "How do you feel?" Luke asked, studying her face for signs of lingering effects from her head injury. "Strong enough to travel," she replied with more confidence than he suspected she felt, "though I admit the thought of a week on horseback isn't appealing. We'll take it slow. Better to arrive safely than not at all." Emma emerged from the cabin carrying Luke's old coat, which still swallowed her small frame. The child had proven remarkably adaptable, accepting their situation with a maturity that continued to impress him. "Are we really going to see a judge?" she asked, excitement overriding her obvious nervousness about leaving the safety of the cabin. "We're going to try," Luke said honestly. "But it won't be easy. There are people who want to stop us from reaching Denver. Because of Papa's papers." "Because those papers can send some very powerful men to prison," Emma nodded solemnly. "Good. They should go to prison for killing Papa." Luke felt a pang of recognition at the child's desire for justice. He'd carried similar feelings about his own family's killers, though his quest for revenge had ultimately proven hollow. Perhaps helping Emma and Sarah find justice would provide the closure his own heart had never achieved. "Luke," Sarah said quietly, drawing him aside while Emma fed carrots to the horses. "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." "All right. What aren't you telling us about yourself? You move like a soldier, think like a strategist, and last night you fought like a man with extensive combat experience. Yet you live alone on a mountain, avoiding all human contact." Sarah's eyes searched his face. "Who are you really?" Luke considered how much to reveal. These people had entrusted him with their lives. They deserved to know what kind of man they were depending on. "My name is Luke Calder," he said finally. "I was a cavalry scout during the war between the states, then a deputy federal marshal afterward. I came to this mountain 16 years ago, after my family was killed by raiders." Sarah's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry. That explains a great deal. Does it change anything?" "It changes everything," Sarah replied. "It means you understand loss the way Emma and I do. It means you know why justice matters." Luke nodded, surprised by how much her acceptance meant to him. "The men who killed my family were never caught. I spent 2 years hunting them, and it nearly destroyed what was left of my soul. I won't let that happen to you and Emma. What if we can't avoid it? What if seeking justice for Tom puts us all in danger?" Luke met her gaze directly. "Then we face that danger together, but we don't give up." They mounted their horses as the sun climbed above the eastern peaks, Luke on Ryder, Sarah on a gentle mare named Patience, and Emma sharing the saddle with her mother. The pack horse carried their supplies and several items. Luke hoped they wouldn't need extra ammunition, bandages, and a military field surgeon's kit he'd kept from his martial days. The trail down the mountain was treacherous with ice and hidden rocks, requiring constant attention from both horses and riders. Luke set a careful pace, frequently stopping to rest and check on Sarah's condition. The head injury had affected her balance, and more than once she swayed dangerously in the saddle. "I can ride by myself," Emma insisted after watching her mother struggle to maintain her seat. "Absolutely not," Sarah replied firmly. "You're staying right where I can protect you." Luke admired the woman's determination, but he could see she was pushing herself beyond reasonable limits. By midday, when they stopped to rest and eat, Sarah's face was pale with exhaustion and pain. "We should make camp early tonight," Luke suggested diplomatically. "These mountain trails are dangerous after dark." Sarah started to protest, then seemed to realize the wisdom of his suggestion. "Perhaps you're right. I don't want to slow us down unnecessarily." "You're not slowing us down. We're being careful." That evening, they camped in a sheltered valley Luke had used many times during his hunting trips. A small stream provided fresh water, and the surrounding hills offered protection from wind and observation. Luke built a carefully concealed fire, while Sarah and Emma arranged their bedrolls. As they ate supper beans and hardtack, supplemented with trout, Luke, caught from the stream, Emma peppered him with questions about his military service and his life before the mountain. Her curiosity was natural, but Luke found himself sharing stories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Did you ever get scared during battles?" Emma asked. "Every time," Luke replied honestly. "Anyone who says they're not scared in a fight is either lying or crazy. But you fought anyway. Being scared doesn't mean being helpless. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you're afraid and then do what needs to be done, despite that fear." Sarah watched this exchange with growing interest. "You're good with children. Did you have any of your own?" Luke's expression tightened. "Two, a daughter about Emma's age, and a younger son. What were their names?" Emma asked softly. "Lily and Samuel. Do you miss them?" The simple question hit Luke harder than any amount of adult sympathy. "Every day," he said quietly. Emma reached over and took his hand with the unconscious compassion of childhood. "I miss Papa every day too. Mama says missing people means we loved them very much." Luke squeezed the child's hand gently, feeling emotions he'd buried for 16 years, threatening to surface. "Your mama's very wise." Later, after Emma had fallen asleep between Luke and Sarah, the two adults sat by the dying fire and talked in low voices about the challenges ahead. "How well do you know this Judge Blackwood?" Sarah asked. "Well enough to trust him with this evidence. His son James used to read me his father's letters. They were full of frustration with political corruption and determination to uphold the law, regardless of consequences. And you think he'll act on what we show him? If the evidence is as strong as you say, he'll have no choice. Federal judges take their oaths seriously." Sarah stared into the fire, her expression troubled. "What if we're wrong? What if this conspiracy reaches even into the federal courts?" "Then we'll find another way," Luke said firmly. "But we don't give up." "You keep saying that, because it's true. Your husband died believing justice was possible. Emma's counting on us to prove he was right. We don't have the luxury of despair." Sarah smiled for the first time since they'd left the cabin. "You know, when Emma first told me about the mountain man who saved us, I pictured someone completely different. Rough, uneducated, probably half wild from living alone. Disappointed?" "Quite the opposite. You're exactly the kind of man Tom would have trusted, someone who understands that doing right sometimes means risking everything." Luke poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky. "I stopped believing in doing right a long time ago. This, helping you and Emma, it's the first time in 16 years I've felt like maybe I could be more than just a man hiding from his failures." "You're not hiding anymore." "No," Luke agreed, glancing at Emma's sleeping form. "I'm not." As if sensing their conversation, Emma stirred and opened her eyes. "Is everything all right?" she asked sleepily. "Everything's fine," Sarah assured her. "Go back to sleep." "Mr. Luke?" "Yes, Emma? Thank you for helping us. Papa would have liked you very much." Luke felt his throat constrict with emotion. "I think I would have liked him too." Emma smiled and closed her eyes again, completely secure in her trust that Luke would keep her and her mother safe. As Luke took first watch, staring out into the darkness beyond their camp, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few days. The solitary existence he'd maintained for 16 years was ending, replaced by responsibility and purpose he'd thought lost forever. Tomorrow would bring them closer to Denver and deeper into danger. But tonight, for the first time since his family's death, Luke Calder felt like he belonged, somewhere protecting the people who'd become important to him. The lone bear was finally coming down from his mountain for good. 3 days into their journey, Luke's careful plans began to unravel. They'd made good time despite Sarah's lingering weakness, following back trails and avoiding main roads where hostile eyes might spot them. But as they approached the settlement of Pine Ridge, their last stop before the final push to Denver, Luke noticed signs that made his blood run cold. Fresh horse tracks in the muddy road, too many for casual travelers. Boot prints near water sources that belonged to men moving with military precision. Most disturbing of all, a wanted poster nailed to a tree beside the trail, a poster bearing his own likeness and offering $1,000 reward for his capture. Luke studied the crude drawing while Sarah and Emma rested their horses nearby. The face was recognizable despite the artist's limited skill, and the charges listed made his stomach clench with familiar dread. "Wanted for murder," the poster proclaimed in bold letters. Luke Calder, also known as the Phantom, armed and extremely dangerous. Wanted for the brutal slaying of Federal Marshal Thomas Bradley and the kidnapping of his wife and daughter, last seen in the Coldridge area. 1, 0, reward, dead or alive. "Luke," Sarah's voice carried a note of concern. "What is it?" He tore down the poster and handed it to her, watching her face pale as she read the accusations. Emma peered over her mother's shoulder, her eyes widening with shock. "But that's not true," Emma protested. "Papa was already dead when we met Mr. Luke." "I know, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, though her eyes remained fixed on Luke's face. "Someone's trying to make it look like Luke killed Papa." Luke's mind raced through the implications. Someone with significant resources and government connections had managed to fabricate evidence implicating him in Tom Bradley's murder. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. This was a carefully orchestrated trap. "They've been planning this from the beginning," Luke said grimly. "The men who attacked my cabin weren't just hunting you, they were setting me up to take the blame for your husband's death." "But why?" Emma asked. "Because if I'm wanted for murder, no one will believe anything I say about corruption or conspiracies." Luke crumpled the poster in his fist. "They've turned me from a potential ally into a liability." Sarah's face hardened with understanding. "And if they kill us while apprehending you, they eliminate all the witnesses and claim they were just enforcing the law." "Exactly." The sound of approaching horses drifted through the trees, multiple riders moving at a steady pace toward their position. Luke quickly counted the hoofbeats, estimating at least 6 horses, possibly more. "Into the trees," he ordered quietly. "Now." They led their horses into thick undergrowth, just as the first riders came into view. Luke counted 8 men, all wearing the distinctive badges of federal marshals, but carrying themselves like hired guns. At their head rode a man Luke recognized with a surge of cold fury. Deputy Marshal Court Brennan, the same corrupt lawman who'd been present the night Luke's family was murdered 16 years ago. The same man who'd ensured the killers were never caught, who'd helped cover up the truth in exchange for blood money. Luke had spent 2 years hunting Brennan before finally accepting that some forms of justice were beyond his reach. Now, seeing the man's scarred face and cold eyes, Luke understood that their reunion was no coincidence. "Spread out," Brennan ordered his men. "They can't be far ahead. The mountain man knows these trails, but he's got a sick woman and a child slowing him down." "What if he doesn't surrender peaceful-like?" one of the deputies asked. Brennan's smile was predatory. "Then we'll have to use appropriate force to protect ourselves. Sometimes desperate fugitives leave the law no choice." Luke felt his hand drift toward his gun, but Sarah's touch on his arm stopped him. She was right. 8 against 1 were impossible odds, especially with Emma present. They needed to be smarter than their enemies, not braver. The fake marshals passed by their hiding spot without detecting them, but Luke knew their reprieve was temporary. Brennan was persistent and cunning. He'd double back when the trail went cold, expanding his search pattern until he found them. "Who was that man?" Sarah whispered once the riders had disappeared. "Someone from my past, someone I should have killed years ago." Luke's voice carried 16 years of accumulated hatred. "Luke, you're scaring me." He forced himself to calm down, to think tactically rather than emotionally. "That man was present the night my family was murdered. He helped cover up the crime, made sure the killers escaped justice." Emma's eyes widened with understanding. "He's one of the bad men." "He's the worst of them," Luke confirmed. "And now he's hunting us with legal authority to kill anyone who resists." "Then what do we do?" Luke studied the terrain around them, his mind working through possibilities. Running would only delay the inevitable. Brennan knew these mountains almost as well as Luke did, and he had superior numbers. Fighting was suicide with Emma present. But there was a third option, one that appealed to the part of Luke that had spent years as a federal marshal himself. "We're going to turn the tables," he said finally. "How?" Luke pulled out the real evidence. Sarah carried Tom Bradley's carefully documented proof of the corruption conspiracy. "Your husband wasn't just investigating stolen reservation money. He was investigating the entire network of corrupt officials who've been bleeding the territory dry for years." "Yes, but including Deputy Marshal Court Brennan." Sarah's breath caught. Tom mentioned that name. He said Brennan was one of the worst, someone who sold his badge to the highest bidder. "Then we have him," Luke said with grim satisfaction. "Brennan's here on false authority, hunting innocent people to protect his criminal associates. If we can prove that, we turn him from hunter into hunted. But how do we prove it when he has 8 men and federal badges?" Luke smiled for the first time since seeing the wanted poster. "Because I have something he doesn't know about friends in high places who owe me favors." He led them deeper into the forest, to a hidden cache he'd established years ago during his martial days. Inside, a waterproof container buried beneath a distinctive rock formation. Luke found items he'd hoped never to need again. A federal marshal's badge and commission papers bearing his own name. "You're still a marshal?" Sarah asked in amazement. "Technically, yes. I never resigned, just took extended leave." Luke pinned the badge to his coat, feeling the weight of authority he'd abandoned 16 years ago. "Marshal commissions don't expire unless specifically revoked, and mine never was. But the wanted poster is fraudulent. Brennan doesn't have authority to issue federal warrants that requires a judge's signature." Luke examined his commission papers, noting they were still valid. "I outrank him, which means I can place him under arrest for corruption and abuse of authority." Emma clapped her hands together. "You're going to arrest the bad marshal? If I can prove he's acting outside the law, yes." "But he has 8 men," Sarah protested. "He has 8 men who think they're following legitimate orders," Luke corrected. "When they discover their leader is corrupt, most of them will stand down rather than face federal charges themselves." It was a dangerous gamble. But Luke had learned long ago that sometimes the boldest action was the safest course. Brennan expected him to run or hide. He wouldn't anticipate a direct confrontation backed by legitimate authority. "What do you need us to do?" Sarah asked. "Stay hidden while I deal with Brennan. If things go badly—" "They won't," Emma interrupted with absolute confidence. "You're the good marshal now. You're going to win." Luke hoped the child's faith wasn't misplaced. In the next few hours, he would either clear his name and bring a corrupt lawman to justice, or die trying. But as he checked his weapons and prepared for the confrontation that would define the rest of their lives, Luke felt something he hadn't experienced since his family's death, the righteous certainty that came from fighting for justice rather than revenge. Marshal Luke Calder was about to reclaim his badge and his honor. The only question was whether he would live long enough to enjoy either. Luke spent the next hour preparing for what might be the final confrontation of his life. He cleaned and loaded his weapons with the methodical precision of a man who understood that survival often depended on such details. The Winchester held 17 rounds, his 2 Colts carried 6 each, and his belt held enough ammunition for a sustained firefight if negotiations failed. But this wouldn't be settled by firepower alone. Luke needed to outthink Brennan, to use the corrupt marshal's own arrogance and assumptions against him. The man had spent 16 years believing himself untouchable, protected by badge and political connections. That confidence would be his weakness. Sarah and Emma watched his preparations with mixture of fear and fascination. The child had never seen anyone prepare for mortal combat, and Luke found himself explaining each step as if teaching a student. "Why do you check each bullet separately?" Emma asked as Luke examined his ammunition. "Because a misfire at the wrong moment can mean the difference between living and dying." Luke replied. Your papa would have understood lawmen learn to trust their equipment completely, or they don't live long enough to learn much of anything. Will you really arrest that bad marshal? If he gives me the chance. But men like Brennan don't surrender easily. Sarah moved closer, her voice low enough that Emma couldn't hear. Luke, be honest with me. What are our chances? Luke considered lying, offering false reassurance, but decided she deserved the truth. 50-50, maybe less. Brennan's dangerous and desperate. He knows if I expose him, he'll hang for corruption and murder. Then why are you doing this? Why not just run? Because running won't solve anything. Brennan will keep hunting us, and others will take his place. Luke holstered his revolvers and picked up the Winchester. Sometimes the only way forward is straight through the danger. And if you don't survive? Luke handed her a sealed envelope he'd written while she slept. Everything you need to reach Judge Blackwood is in their directions. Introductory letter, and enough money to get you to Denver safely. Promise me that if I fall, you'll complete this mission. Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. I promise, but you're coming back to us, Luke Calder. Emma and I need you. The simple declaration hit Luke harder than he'd expected. When was the last time anyone had needed him for anything other than violence? When had he last mattered to another human being beyond his ability to kill? I'll do my best, he said quietly. Emma approached and hugged him around the waist, her small arms barely spanning his breadth. Be careful, Mr. Luke. And remember, Papa always said, the good guys win in the end. Luke knelt to the child's level, looking into eyes that reminded him so much of his lost daughter. Your papa was right. Good does win, but sometimes it takes a while. How long? Sometimes 16 years, Luke said softly. But it still wins. He kissed Emma's forehead gently, then stood and checked his badge one final time. Federal Marshal Luke Calder was about to reclaim his authority after years of self-imposed exile. Stay hidden until you hear from me, he told Sarah. If you hear gunshots and I don't come back within 2 hours, take Emma and ride hard for Denver. Don't stop, don't look back, and don't trust anyone wearing a badge until you reach Judge Blackwood. Luke. No goodbyes, he interrupted gently. Just promises to see each other again. Luke mounted Ryder and began tracking Brennan's party, following their trail through techniques learned during his cavalry and martial years. The corrupt lawman was being sloppy, confident in his superior numbers and authority. His men were leaving clear sign, broken branches, horse droppings, even discarded cigarette butts that marked their passage like breadcrumbs. Within an hour, Luke found them camped in a clearing beside a mountain stream. 8 men around a fire, their horses picketed nearby, weapons stacked but accessible. They'd positioned sentries, but the guards were watching for fleeing fugitives, not for a lone man approaching with legitimate authority. Luke studied the camp through his field glasses, cataloguing details that would determine his approach. Brennan sat apart from his men, consulting a map and occasionally barking orders. The other 7 were typical hired guns, competent but unimaginative, following orders without questioning their source. Most importantly, Luke recognized 2 faces among Brennan's followers, genuine federal marshals he'd worked with years ago. Ben Carter and Mike Sullivan were honest lawmen who'd been deceived about their mission. If Luke could reach them, explain the truth, they might switch sides when the shooting started. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Luke chose his moment carefully, waiting until the sentries were distracted by their supper before making his move. He approached the camp openly, hands visible but ready, trusting in his badge and legitimate authority to protect him until he could explain the situation. Ryder's hoofbeats alerted the sentries before Luke wanted them to, but he pressed forward with the confidence of a man who belonged wherever he chose to be. That's far enough, one guard called, raising his rifle. Federal Marshal Luke Calder, Luke announced in his clearest command voice. I need to speak with Deputy Marshal Brennan immediately. The camp erupted in confused activity as men reached for weapons while trying to understand why a wanted fugitive was riding into their midst wearing a marshal's badge. Brennan rose slowly from beside the fire, his scarred face showing recognition and calculation in equal measure. "Well, well," Brennan said softly. "Luke Calder, I heard you were dead." "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Luke replied, dismounting but keeping Ryder between himself and most of the armed men. "Just like reports of my criminal activities. You're wanted for murder, Calder. Drop your weapons and surrender." "I'm wanted on charges filed by a corrupt deputy marshal who's been taking money from the same men who killed Tom Bradley." Luke's voice carried clearly across the camp. "Charges filed without proper judicial authority in violation of federal law." Ben Carter stepped forward, confusion clear on his honest face. "Luke, what the hell is going on here? Brennan told us you'd murdered a federal marshal and kidnapped his family." "Brennan lied to you, Ben. Tom Bradley was killed by the same corruption network that's been bleeding this territory dry for years. I've got evidence that proves it, evidence that implicates Brennan himself." "That's enough," Brennan snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. You're under arrest." Luke interrupted, his voice ringing with authority. "For corruption, abuse of office, conspiracy to commit murder, and violation of federal statutes regarding the issuance of arrest warrants." The camp fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the nervous shuffling of horses. Luke could see uncertainty in several faces, men beginning to question what they'd been told about their mission. Mike Sullivan, the other marshal Luke recognized, spoke up hesitantly. "Luke, show us your commission. If you're really still a federal marshal." "He's a wanted fugitive," Brennan interrupted desperately. "Don't listen to his lies." Luke slowly reached into his coat and withdrew his commission papers, holding them where everyone could see. Federal Marshal Luke Calder, commissioned 1869, never revoked or suspended. "Ben, you know my signature. You've seen it on enough reports." Carter moved closer, studying the documents with the careful attention of a lawman who understood the difference between legitimate authority and clever forgery. "These look genuine," he said slowly. "Because they are genuine," Luke replied. "Which means I outrank Deputy Marshal Brennan, and I'm placing him under arrest for crimes against the United States government." "This is insane!" Brennan exploded, his composure finally cracking. "He's a murderer. I have a warrant." "You have a piece of paper with no judicial signature," Luke interrupted calmly. "Federal warrants require a judge's authorization, court. You know that as well as I do." Sullivan examined the wanted poster Brennan had been carrying, his expression growing troubled. "Luke's right, there's no judge's seal on this warrant. Who authorized the charges?" "I did," Brennan snapped. On authority of what?" Luke pressed. "Deputy marshals can't issue federal warrants, and you know it, which means you're operating outside the law, court, just like you did 16 years ago." The mention of the past made Brennan's face go white with rage and fear. Luke could see the corrupt marshal's mind racing, searching for a way out of the trap that was closing around him. "I don't know what game you're playing, Calder," Brennan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "but it ends here." "Yes," Luke agreed quietly. "It does." The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. 8 armed men trying to understand which of their leaders was telling the truth. Luke could see doubt spreading through the group as they began to question everything they'd been told about their mission. "Ben," Luke said without taking his eyes off Brennan, "radio Denver and ask Judge Blackwood to confirm my status. Tell him Luke Calder is requesting verification of commission standing." "We don't have radio contact from here," Carter replied. "But Luke, if you're really a federal marshal, why were you wanted for murder?" "Because the same men who killed Tom Bradley needed someone to blame for his death. They chose me because I live alone, have no alibis, and would be perfect scapegoat." Luke's voice grew harder. "They didn't count on me still having friends in the service." "Friends like who?" Sullivan demanded. Like Judge Harrison Blackwood, whose son James saved my life at Antietam. Like Marshal Frank Morrison in Cheyenne, who served under me when I was tracking the Dalton gang. Like you, Ben, if you're still the honest lawman I remember. Carter's face showed recognition and growing certainty. Jesus, Luke, if you're telling the truth, then we've been played for fools, Sullivan finished grimly. Sent to hunt an innocent man while the real killers escape justice. Brennan could see his authority crumbling, his carefully constructed lies falling apart under scrutiny. His hand moved incrementally closer to his gun, and Luke tensed for the violence that was becoming inevitable. Even if Calder is a marshal, Brennan said desperately, he's still wanted for murder. We have a duty. We have a duty to uphold the law, Carter interrupted, his own hand resting on his weapon. Not to follow illegal orders from corrupt officials. Corrupt? Brennan's voice rose to a near shriek. I've served this territory faithfully for 20 years. You've served yourself for 20 years, Luke corrected, taking money from whoever paid best, covering up crimes, and letting killers walk free, just like you did the night my family died. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged gun. Several of Brennan's hired men began backing away, sensing the personal nature of the conflict and wanting no part of whatever was about to unfold. I don't know what you're talking about, Brennan said, but his voice lacked conviction. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You were there that night, Court. You saw who killed my wife and children, and you helped them escape. Prove it! Luke smiled grimly and pulled a folded paper from his pocket, another document from Tom Bradley's evidence file. I don't have to prove it. Marshal Bradley already did. He read aloud from the paper, Deputy Marshal Court Brennan, present during Calder family massacre, failed to pursue known perpetrators in exchange for payment of $500 from persons unknown. Witness testimony confirms Brennan's direct involvement in covering up the crime. Brennan's face went ashen. That's impossible. Bradley couldn't have known. Bradley was a thorough investigator. He found witnesses you thought were dead, Court. He documented everything. The corrupt marshal's composure finally shattered completely. You sanctimonious bastard. You think you're so pure, so righteous. But you ran away like a coward when your family needed you most. The words hit Luke like physical blows, striking at his deepest guilt and shame. For 16 years, he'd tormented himself with the same accusation that he'd failed his family when they needed him most. But Emma's trusting face appeared in his mind, followed by Sarah's grateful smile and the memory of holding them safe in his cabin. Some failures could be redeemed through new choices, new commitments to protect those who needed protection. You're right, Luke said quietly. I did run away. I ran from responsibility, from connection, from everything that mattered, but I'm not running anymore. Good, Brennan snarled, his hand dropping toward his gun, because this time I'm going to finish what those Comanche raiders started. Luke's hand was already moving when Brennan cleared leather. 16 years of mountain living, having kept his reflexes sharp despite his age. The two shots came so close together they sounded like one, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Brennan's bullet went wide, thrown off by the shock of Luke's faster draw. Luke's shot took the corrupt marshal center mass, spinning him around and sending him sprawling beside the campfire. The other men stood frozen, hands hovering over weapons but uncertain whether to draw them. Carter and Sullivan had their guns out, but pointed at the ground, torn between conflicting loyalties and confused by the rapid turn of events. It's over, Luke announced, his smoking Colt still trained on Brennan's motionless form. The warrant against me was fraudulent, issued by a corrupt official who's now dead. I'm taking command of this operation under federal authority. What are your orders, Marshal? Carter asked formally, holstering his weapon in acceptance of Luke's authority. Return to Denver and report to Judge Blackwood. Tell him Marshal Luke Calder is back on active duty and needs to discuss a matter of territorial corruption. What about the woman and child we were supposed to arrest? They're under my protection as material witnesses in a federal investigation. Any attempt to harm them will be considered an attack on a federal marshal and his charges. Sullivan nodded slowly. Understood, sir. What about Brennan's body? Leave it for the local authorities. He died resisting arrest during the commission of federal crimes. As the genuine marshals organized their men for departure, Luke felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that had pressed down on him for 16 years. Justice might be slow, but it was still possible for those willing to fight for it. Brennan was dead, his corruption exposed, and the evidence that could bring down his associates was safe in Sarah's possession. More importantly, Luke had reclaimed not just his badge, but his sense of purpose. The sun was setting as the former posse rode away, leaving Luke alone with his thoughts and his victory. But his triumph felt incomplete. It wouldn't be real until he could share it with the woman and child who'd given him reason to care about justice again. Luke mounted Ryder and turned toward the hidden camp where Sarah and Emma waited, eager to tell them that their long nightmare was finally ending. The mountain man had found his family, and the marshal had found his badge. Now it was time to finish what Tom Bradley had started. Luke found Sarah and Emma exactly where he'd left them, hidden in a grove of aspens whose golden leaves provided perfect camouflage. Emma saw him first and came running, her face bright with relief and joy. "Mr. Luke, you're safe." She threw herself into his arms with the abandon of a child who'd been terrified of losing another protector. Luke held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling his heart swell with an emotion he'd thought dead forever. "I'm safe, little one, and so are you." Sarah approached more cautiously, her eyes searching his face for signs of what had transpired. "Brennan, dead," Luke said simply. "He drew on me first, made it self-defense. The other marshals accepted my authority and rode back to Denver. So it's over? Almost." Luke released Emma, but kept one hand on her shoulder. "We still need to get that evidence to Judge Blackwood and let the law handle the rest of the conspiracy." "But the dangerous part is over?" Luke hesitated, then decided honesty was still the best policy. "The immediate danger is over. But powerful men don't give up easily when their crimes are exposed. We'll need to be careful until we reach Denver." Emma looked up at him with complete trust. "You'll protect us." "With my life," Luke promised, meaning every word. They rode through the night, taking advantage of the confusion Brennan's death would cause among his associates. Luke pushed the pace harder than he would have preferred, but urgency outweighed caution now. Every hour they delayed gave the conspiracy more time to cover their tracks or eliminate witnesses. Sarah proved stronger than Luke had expected, staying in the saddle despite her exhaustion and never complaining about the grueling pace. Emma dozed fitfully against her mother's back, waking occasionally to ask how much farther they had to travel. "Are we really going to see a judge?" she asked, during one of their brief rest stops. "Judge Harrison Blackwood," Luke confirmed. "He's a good man who'll make sure your papa's killers face justice. Will he send them to prison? If the evidence is as strong as your mama says, they'll hang." Emma nodded with satisfaction that would have been disturbing in an adult, but seemed natural in a child who'd lost her father to violence. "Good. Papa always said bad people should pay for the bad things they do. Your papa was right about a lot of things." They reached the outskirts of Denver as the sun climbed above the eastern plains, painting the city's buildings in warm, golden light. Luke had visited the territorial capital several times during his marshal days, but the settlement had grown dramatically in the intervening years. New buildings lined streets that had been dirt paths during his last visit, and the population had swelled with miners, railroad workers, and the inevitable collection of merchants, gamblers, and opportunists who followed money wherever it flowed. Luke led them through the busy streets toward the federal courthouse, an imposing stone building that represented the growing power of territorial law. He'd telegrammed ahead from their last stop, requesting an urgent meeting with Judge Blackwood on a matter of federal importance. The courthouse lobby bustled with morning activity, lawyers consulting with clients, clerks hurrying between offices, and the usual collection of citizens seeking justice or mercy from the territorial government. Luke approached the information desk, his marshal's badge drawing immediate attention from the clerk. "Marshal Calder to see Judge Blackwood," he announced. "He's expecting us." The clerk consulted his appointment book, then looked up with surprise. "You're Luke Calder? The judge has been asking about you for years. He'll be delighted to see you again." They were escorted through corridors lined with portraits of territorial officials, past offices where the business of law and government proceeded with methodical efficiency. Emma stayed close to Luke's side, her eyes wide with wonder at the formal grandeur surrounding them. Judge Harrison Blackwood's office occupied a corner of the building's top floor, with windows offering a commanding view of the city and the mountains beyond. The man himself stood behind an ornate desk, reviewing documents with the careful attention Luke remembered from his son's descriptions. Judge Blackwood was in his 60s, with silver hair and the penetrating gaze of someone accustomed to determining truth from conflicting testimony. When he looked up and saw Luke, his face broke into a genuine smile of welcome. "Luke Calder," he said warmly, coming around the desk with his hand extended. "I wondered if I'd ever see you again. When I received your telegram, I hardly dared hope you were well." "Judge Blackwood," Luke replied, accepting the handshake. "Thank you for seeing us on such short notice." "Nonsense. After what you did for James during the war, you'll always be welcome in my home or office." The judge's expression grew more serious as he noticed Sarah and Emma. "But I suspect this isn't a social call." "No, sir. This is Mrs. Sarah Bradley and her daughter Emma. Mrs. Bradley's husband was Federal Marshal Tom Bradley." Judge Blackwood's face darkened with recognition. "Marshal Bradley, the one who was killed investigating corruption. A tragic loss. Please, sit down, all of you." Luke helped Emma into a chair while Sarah arranged her skirts nervously. The child had been remarkably well behaved throughout their journey, but the formal setting seemed to intimidate her. "Mrs. Bradley," Judge Blackwood said gently, "please accept my condolences on your husband's death. Tom Bradley was an honest lawman in a territory that needs more of them." "Thank you, Your Honor," Sarah replied quietly. "Tom spoke of you often. He said you were one of the few officials who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Your husband was too kind, but I suspect you didn't come here for pleasantries." Sarah glanced at Luke, who nodded encouragingly. She reached into her bag and withdrew the oilcloth-wrapped documents that had cost so much blood and danger to protect. Tom gathered evidence of a conspiracy involving territorial officials, federal marshals, and private businessmen, she said, placing the package on Judge Blackwood's desk. "They've been stealing money intended for Indian reservations and using it to buy mining rights and railroad property." Judge Blackwood carefully unwrapped the documents, his expression growing more serious as he examined the evidence. Luke watched the judge's face, seeing the exact moment when the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "Dear God," Blackwood whispered, "this reaches all the way to the territorial capital. These signatures, these bank records, if this is authentic, it represents one of the largest corruption scandals in the territory's history." "It's authentic," Luke confirmed. "Marshal Bradley died protecting that evidence, and Mrs. Bradley has risked her life to bring it to you. The men involved in this conspiracy have been hunting us for months," Sarah added. "They killed Tom when he got too close to the truth, and they've been trying to silence Emma and me ever since." Judge Blackwood studied the documents for several more minutes, occasionally asking Sarah to clarify specific details or explain her husband's investigative methods. Emma sat quietly throughout the examination, occasionally touching Luke's hand for reassurance. "This evidence is damning," Judge Blackwood finally announced. "With proper presentation, it's enough to secure convictions against everyone involved. But prosecuting men this powerful will be dangerous." "More dangerous than letting them continue stealing and killing?" Luke asked. "Point taken." Judge Blackwood smiled grimly. "I assume you're volunteering to help with the arrests, Marshal Calder. If you'll have me back on active duty, yes, sir. Consider yourself reinstated immediately. The territory needs honest marshals now more than ever." Luke felt a surge of satisfaction as his official status was confirmed. After 16 years of exile, he was once again a federal marshal with the authority to pursue justice. But their celebration was premature. The sound of gunfire erupted from the courthouse lobby, followed by screams and running footsteps. Luke was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun as he positioned himself between the door and Emma. "Stay down," he ordered, pushing Sarah and Emma behind Judge Blackwood's massive desk. More shots echoed from the corridors, accompanied by the sound of boots on marble floors and harsh voices shouting orders. Judge Blackwood moved to his wall safe, withdrawing a shotgun and a box of shells, with the efficiency of a man who'd faced violence before. "They've found us," Sarah whispered, her face pale with fear. "Who?" Judge Blackwood demanded, checking his weapon. "The men behind the conspiracy," Luke replied, peering carefully through the office window. "They must have watchers at the courthouse, waiting for anyone who might threaten their operation." In the street below, Luke could see armed men taking positions around the building. At least a dozen, all carrying rifles and moving with military precision. This wasn't a desperate last stand, it was a planned assault, designed to eliminate everyone who'd seen Tom Bradley's evidence. "Your Honor," Luke said urgently, "is there another way out of this building?" "Service stairs in the back, but they'll have those covered too if they're professionals." "They are professionals," Luke confirmed grimly. "The question is whether we fight our way out or wait for help." "What help?" Sarah asked from behind the desk. Judge Blackwood was already moving toward a telegraph key mounted on his office wall. "I can signal the army post outside town. Colonel Mitchell owes me several favors." "Do it," Luke said, "but it'll take time for troops to arrive, and I don't think these men plan to wait." The sound of gunfire was getting closer, suggesting the attackers were fighting their way through whatever courthouse security existed. Luke counted shots, trying to estimate how many men they faced and what kind of weapons they carried. "Emma," he said quietly, "remember what I taught you about being brave?" The child nodded solemnly from her position beside her mother. "I need you to be braver than you've ever been before. Can you do that?" "Yes, Mr. Luke." "Good girl." Judge Blackwood finished his telegraph message and returned to his desk, where he began stuffing Tom Bradley's evidence into a leather satchel. "If something happens to us, this evidence needs to survive," he said. "It's the only way to ensure those men face justice." "Nothing's going to happen to us," Luke said with more confidence than he felt. "We're going to get out of here alive, and we're going to see every one of those corrupt bastards hang." The office door exploded inward as armed men burst through, weapons raised and faces hard with killing intent. Luke's first shot took the lead attacker in the chest, spinning him backward into his companions. Judge Blackwood's shotgun roared a split second later, filling the doorway with buckshot and screams. "Behind the desk!" Luke shouted, firing rapidly to keep the attackers from advancing. Sarah pulled Emma tight against her, shielding the child with her own body, while Luke and Judge Blackwood fought to hold their position. The office filled with gun smoke and the deafening sound of gunfire as more attackers poured through the shattered doorway. Luke's ammunition ran low, quickly, too quickly. He'd been carrying extra rounds, but sustained firefights consumed bullets faster than most people realized. Judge Blackwood's shotgun was even more limited, holding only 2 shells at a time. "I'm almost out," Judge Blackwood called over the noise. "Me too," Luke replied, dropping his empty revolver and drawing his second Colt. The attackers sensed their advantage and pressed forward, forcing Luke and the judge to retreat behind the heavy desk. Bullets splintered wood and shattered windows, filling the air with flying debris. Emma's small voice cut through the chaos. "Mr. Luke, your rifle." Luke looked where she was pointing and saw his Winchester leaning against the wall where he'd left it when they entered the office. The rifle held 17 rounds, enough to turn the tide if he could reach it. "Cover me," he told Judge Blackwood, then sprinted across the open space. Bullets whined past his head as he dove for the Winchester, his fingers closing around the familiar stock, just as a slug gouged splinters from the wall beside him. Rolling behind a filing cabinet, Luke worked the rifle's lever and began returning accurate fire. The Winchester's range and power gave Luke the advantage he needed. His first shot dropped an attacker who'd been advancing on the desk. His second and third shots drove the others back into the corridor, buying precious time for Judge Blackwood to reload his shotgun. "How many of them are there?" Sarah called from behind the desk. "Too many," Luke replied honestly, continuing to fire at any target that presented itself. The sound of running feet in the corridor suggested reinforcements were arriving, but Luke couldn't tell if they were more attackers or courthouse security responding to the gunfire. He prayed for the latter but prepared for the former. Then Emma's voice rose again, high and clear. "Soldiers! I can see soldiers!" Luke risked a glance through the shattered window and felt his heart leap with hope. Blue uniformed cavalry was charging down the street, rifles ready and sabers glinting in the morning sun. Colonel Mitchell had received Judge Blackwood's message and responded with typical military efficiency. The attackers in the corridor must have seen the approaching troops as well, because their gunfire slackened noticeably. Luke heard urgent voices discussing retreat, followed by the sound of boots running toward the back of the building. "They're pulling out," Judge Blackwood announced. "Not all of them," Luke corrected, spotting movement in the doorway. One last attacker appeared, his rifle aimed directly at Sarah and Emma behind the desk. Luke's Winchester was empty, and his revolvers were too far away to reach in time. Without thinking, Luke threw himself across the office, placing his body between the gunman and the family he'd sworn to protect. The rifle cracked, and Luke felt the bullet tear through his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the floor. But Judge Blackwood's shotgun spoke a final time, and the last attacker fell backward into the corridor, his threat ended forever. "Luke!" Sarah's voice was filled with anguish as she rushed to his side. "I'm all right," Luke gasped, though blood was spreading across his shirt. "Just a flesh wound." Emma knelt beside him, her small hands pressing against his shoulder to slow the bleeding. "You saved us," she whispered. "You saved us again." Luke smiled despite the pain. That's what families do for each other. The sound of soldiers filling the courthouse below told them the immediate danger was over. The conspiracy had made its final desperate play and failed. Justice would now follow its proper course. As Sarah helped him sit up against the wall, Luke looked at the evidence scattered across Judge Blackwood's desk and felt a deep satisfaction despite his wound. Tom Bradley's sacrifice had meaning. His killers would face justice, and Luke Calder had finally found his way home. 6 months later, Luke stood on the front porch of a modest house on the outskirts of Denver, watching Emma chase butterflies through their garden, while Sarah hung laundry on the line. His left shoulder still ached when storms approached, but the wound had healed cleanly, leaving only a scar to remind him of that violent morning in Judge Blackwood's office. The trials were over now. 14 men had been convicted of conspiracy, corruption, and murder based on Tom Bradley's evidence. 5 had received death sentences, including the territorial official who'd ordered the attack on the courthouse. 9 others would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. Justice had been served, but the cost had been heavy. 3 courthouse guards had died in the assault, along with 4 of the attacking gunmen. Luke sometimes wondered if there might have been another way, a path to the same result with less bloodshed. But then he would see Emma's smile or feel Sarah's hand in his, and he knew that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the price. "Papa Luke," Emma called from the garden, using the name that still brought tears to his eyes. "Come see what I found." Luke walked down the porch steps, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight. Judge Blackwood had offered him a position as Chief Territorial Marshal, but Luke had preferred to remain a field officer. He liked the work better, and it allowed him to spend more time with his family. Emma was kneeling beside a rose bush, examining something with the intense curiosity of childhood. When Luke approached, she held up a small bird with a broken wing. "Can we help him?" she asked hopefully. "We can try," Luke said, carefully taking the injured creature. "Your mama knows about nursing hurt things back to health." They carried the bird inside, where Sarah was preparing their evening meal. The house was small but comfortable. With furniture Luke had built himself and curtains Sarah had sewn from fabric Emma had chosen. It felt more like home than anywhere Luke had lived since his childhood. "Another patient?" Sarah asked with amusement, examining the bird's wing. "Emma found him," Luke explained. "I told her you're good at healing broken things." Sarah's eyes met his over Emma's head, filled with the warmth and affection that still surprised him sometimes. "I've had good teachers," she said softly. They spent the evening caring for the bird, Emma helping with the gentle concentration she brought to all living creatures. Luke marveled at the child's capacity for compassion. Despite everything she'd endured, she remained determined to help anything that was hurt or lost. After Emma went to bed, Luke and Sarah sat on their porch swing, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. These quiet moments were precious to Luke, reminders of how dramatically his life had changed since that snowy day in Coldridge. "Do you ever miss the mountain?" Sarah asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "Sometimes," Luke admitted, "but not the loneliness. I thought I wanted to be alone, but I was just afraid of caring about people again. And now?" Luke kissed the top of her head gently. "Now I know that caring is what makes life worth living. Emma taught me that, and so did you. We all taught each other," Sarah said. "Emma learned that she could trust adults to protect her. I learned that not all men are weak or selfish, and you learned that your heart wasn't as broken as you thought. Pretty wise for a woman who married a gruff old mountain man." Sarah laughed softly. "You're not old, and you're not gruff anymore. You're just Luke, the man who risked everything to save two strangers because it was the right thing to do." Inside the house, they could hear Emma talking quietly to the injured bird, promising it would get better soon and warning it to be careful around cats. The child's voice carried the absolute certainty that love and care could heal any wound. Luke had learned to believe in that certainty again. "Judge Blackwood stopped by today while you were working," Sarah mentioned casually. "Everything all right?" "More than all right. He wanted to tell us that the federal government is establishing a new program to help families who've lost breadwinners to corruption or crime. They're calling it the Bradley Foundation, in honor of Tom." Luke felt a surge of pride and satisfaction. Tom Bradley's name would be remembered for something positive, something that helped rather than hurt. "That's fitting." The judge also said they want you to head the program's investigative division. Better pay, less travel, more time at home. Luke considered the offer. Part of him was tempted by the security and prestige, but another part valued the freedom of field work. "What do you think?" "I think you should do whatever makes you happy. Emma and I will support any decision you make. What makes me happy is coming home to you and Emma every night, knowing you're safe and loved." Luke tightened his arm around Sarah's shoulders. "I'll think about the judge's offer." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to night sounds and enjoying each other's presence. Luke thought about the long journey that had brought them together, the pain, the danger, the gradual discovery that broken hearts could heal when given proper care. "Sarah? Yes? Do you think Tom would approve of us, of what we've built together?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Tom loved Emma more than life itself. He would approve of anything that makes her happy and keeps her safe. And seeing her with you, seeing how much he loves you and trusts you, I know he would be grateful." "I hope so. I never want to take his place in her heart, but—" "You haven't taken his place," Sarah interrupted gently. "You've made a new place, one that's entirely your own. Emma has room in her heart for both her fathers, the one who gave her life and the one who gave her back her childhood." Luke felt tears threatening and didn't try to stop them. These were good tears, healing tears, the kind that washed away old pain and made room for new joy. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you too." From inside the house came Emma's voice, calling softly, "Papa Luke, the bird is feeling better. I think his wing is going to heal." Luke smiled, understanding that the child was talking about more than just the injured creature. Healing was possible for anyone willing to accept love and care from others. It just took time, patience, and the courage to trust again. "I'll be right there, sweetheart," he called back, He stood and extended his hand to Sarah, who took it with the grace that had first caught his attention in Judge Blackwood's office. Together, they walked into their home, where Emma waited with a bird whose wing was mending and a heart full of love for the family they'd all chosen to build together. Outside, the mountain peaks stood silhouetted against the stars, no longer calling Luke back to solitude. He'd found something better than peace in the high country. He'd found purpose in the valley, surrounded by people who needed him and whom he needed in return. The lone bear had become a family man, and Luke Calder had finally come home for good. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all.